from UNF. I graduated with my bachelor's in community interpreting, and this past May in 2024, my master's in educational interpreting. For the last 2 years, I've been a working interpreter at Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. I also recently signed from the agency, so doing other community work, educational work as well. During my time here, I was also an ambassador for our college, so I helped with recruitment and outreach, specifically for our program. And for my master's research this past spring, I presented on the topic that you'll be learning about today: the relationship between language barriers and social isolation and loneliness in deaf and hard of hearing students in mainstream settings. My advising faculty were Dr. Carolyn Ball and Dr. Mark Howell. You're so smart. Okay. So, during the 1900s, in the 70s and 90s, there was an international revolution in countries' views on education regarding students with disabilities, or what we now decide to say exceptionalities. A few different laws were implemented to provide and protect rights to equal education. Arguably the most impactful one in the United States is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1990, which provided a free, appropriate public education for FAPE, and advocated that students would be educated in mainstream settings, or what we call their least restrictive environment, which is often interpreted as the mainstream setting, where a vast majority of students who are non-deaf or hard of hearing are found, and so they're typically by themselves. These are the various laws that I found during my research. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, 1975, the public law that we now call Education for All Handicapped Children Act, later dubbed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA for short, which again was the one that provided FAPE and the LRE. In 1990, Americans with Disabilities Act, what we call the ADA. And then there's also the Convention on the Rights of the Children CRC efforts, which are funded and hosted by the United Nations. So it's an international law, not just our country. And then standard rules of the equalization of opportunities for persons with disabilities, which was also adopted by the UN. Before I go any further, I forgot to mention why I chose this topic. When you look at the dialogue concerning mental health, it is severely increased and become more popular in the last decade, I would say, which I'll continue to talk about in the presentation. But it really made me realize some things that were going on in my own life. In high school, I, for the first time ever, had a panic attack my sophomore year. Something that I did not have any terminology for, or any concept or understanding of until I had my third one, my first semester here at UNF. So to me, mental health is a very important topic that more people need to be discussing. More people need to have resources on, knowledge on, and empower people to deal with it and confront it head on. I also experienced depression during my sophomore year of high school and at various times throughout COVID. And to be quite transparent with you, the last month I have had some depressive episodes, as well as some times where I was severely anxious and stressed throughout my days. And I had to come to family members and friends and tell them I am not doing too well. So imagine if you don't have a support system. If you're a student who has a language barrier, whether you're deaf, hard of hearing, whether you are Hispanic and you speak Spanish, whether you're Portuguese and you speak Portuguese, maybe you're from Asia and you speak Chinese, Mandarin, Korean, whatever, and there's no way to convey that you need that help, there's no way to access those resources, then it's not going to be very easy for you to continue on doing the best that you can do academically, or even holistically in your life overall. So that's why I chose this topic, because in working with deaf and hard of hearing students as an educational interpreter, I would like to be able to recognize those signs and get them in touch with the correct professionals in the school system who can help them. So, as I mentioned before, that while there's been an increase in the conversation, access to those resources has not been increasing. So advocating for the rights of children to receive an education is a great stride and advancement in our society, and that's undeniable. However, the problem is that despite enacting laws promoting inclusion practices commonly refer to a student who's placed, or to where a student is placed in education, and there's still a failure to consider full integration into that environment, and that includes social integration. So most deaf and hard of hearing students in mainstream settings are often isolated in the education system. So mainstream settings are typically what we call public schools. There's mostly going to be hearing peers there and hearing faculty. In 2004, the U.S. Department of Education found that approximately 85% of deaf and hard of hearing students were in a mainstream school. 85%. And of them, 43% of them spent their school day in a general education classroom. So your typical classroom that you think of when you think of school. So they're not in a self-contained class where there might be one other deaf person. They're not in a class that is fully for deaf students. They're pretty much with hearing peers all day. Then, in 2020, the U.S. Department of Education reported that 87.9% of students were in mainstream school and in regular classrooms for 80% of their day. So that's only increased over the last decade. Or the last 2 decades, actually. Then the Department of Education continues to track these things, and you can see a steady increase throughout time. So these proportions are mirrored in other countries, so my research isn't just focused on the US, it can apply to anywhere where you find a deaf student in a mainstream setting. So for example, in Israel, 80% of deaf and hard of hearing students are in mainstream settings. And although most of the deaf and hard of hearing students are in mainstream settings, so like the majority of them, like we said, over 80% are there, they're still isolated because they're scattered throughout the education system. And they then have to quickly develop social isolation due to communication differences or language barriers. So isolation, especially over extended periods of time, can take a significant toll on one's mental health and their academic performance, right? So think about if you're stressed or if you're not getting the emotional support you need, then it's hard to focus in class, so it's hard to perform well. Isolation also refers to the perceptions and observations made of the subject, while loneliness refers to the feelings determined by the subject and their firsthand experience. So one is looking from the outside and judging a student, the other is the student telling you how they feel for themselves. The public discourse on mental health has gained more attention in the past several years. However, the deaf community is often left out of the conversation, and the development of research and resources are lacking, especially when considering and examining the effects of mental health in deaf and hard of hearing adolescents. My central question was, in what ways do language barriers influence the social isolation and loneliness of DJ students in mainstream settings? So I have a bunch of sub-questions, but this was the main one that I'm focusing on, and from there developed other sub-questions to kind of hone in on that link between the two. For my participants, I would need a minimum of 100 students. They would have to be deaf or hard of hearing. Currently enrolled in a mainstream setting, granted parent or guardian permission if they're under the age of 18. And if they're not under the age of 18, then they need to be legally emancipated. So they have the legal right to make decisions on their own behalf, or they need to be 18 older. Another stipulation is that they would be age 30 or under, and we're in a mainstream setting for a minimum of 1 full school year. So I've built this specific stipulation in to minimize the difference between age gaps and generational gaps. So as our generations and our times have gone on, we've had technological improvements. We've had changes in laws, like the ones I went over toward the beginning of the presentation, right? All of these things would impact where a student was placed, how a student would interact with their peers, and those sorts of things. And then also a minimum of a full school year, because let's say they're only there for 1 month. Well, that data is not really going to help me, because in 1 month, you may not have had enough time to assimilate to the setting and to other groups in the school. So I feel 1 school year is enough time to see how did you actually fare throughout the year. Another stipulation is that language preferences can be English and or ASL and or sign system on the language spectrum between the two. So really just a fancy way of saying I don't care what your language is, as long as it's somewhere between English and ASL. I don't care if it's PSE, I don't care if it's C, I don't care if it's CASE. I don't care if you like to sing comp for yourself. Really, I just want to see that you have some type of communication that allows you to interact. And finally, that they're eligible regardless of utilization of assistive listening devices or technology or interpreters. So really just open door, you're all welcome. This would be a survey style research project. It'd be qualitative because I'm asking you about your experiences. And then participants would self-report their mental health status and struggles and share their experiences. And then participants will provide testimonials. Then I would use an analytical approach of a thematic analysis. This is basically when a researcher closely examines the data to identify common themes or topics or ideas or patterns of meaning that come up repeatedly when I'm looking at the testimonials they've given to me. So one researcher had said that almost every student they spoke to used the same 3 things: isolation, rejection, loneliness, right? That would be a theme that comes up in the research. I would look for the same thing. Are you using the same terminology? And even if you're not using the same exact terminology, can I group some of your experiences together and see a recurring pattern? So trends and patterns identified would focus on triggers and precursors of social isolation and manifestations of loneliness. So what's causing you to feel isolated and how is that loneliness expressed? Then I would identify differences in lived experiences as it relates to the severity of isolation and loneliness. So is it you're lonely maybe once a week, or do you feel like a constant cloud is hanging over you every day? Distinguishing between those severity and phases, so early, moderate, and severe. And then finally noticing how modes of communication then impact the degree to which students experience those things, the loneliness and isolation. So, for example, with my participants, I said I don't care if you use English only, ASL only, a mix, doesn't matter. Because now when I have a variety of modes of communication, I can see, okay, well, if a student is deaf or hard of hearing in a mainstream setting and they only use ASL, maybe they tend to experience a stronger severity of loneliness because there's no crossover in language. Versus a student who may only use English, okay, well their peers might be more socially accepting of them because we share language. Or maybe they use PSC or a mix of the two and they're kind of in the two worlds at once. Then for the use of results, first and formally advocacy. So then developing maybe training on how you can be an interpreter and start to spot these things. Maybe it's empowering the deaf student themselves to then speak up for themselves. Also identifying the triggers and the precursors. That way you can have intervention at those various stages that I mentioned, the early, moderate, and severe. And then also developing resources for students and the greater deaf community. Because again, the deaf community is being left out of the conversation as a whole overall. So why not take what I find with students and then also translate it to the entire community. Then finally, the impact. Why is this research important? Without the research, IEP teams, which are our individualized education plan teams, so every student with a disability or exceptionality has a specific plan that is more binding on how you accommodate for them. But without this research, those teams would be ill-prepared. How are you going to serve a student if you don't understand how the student is thinking, how they process these experiences, how they process these emotions, how these experiences and emotions affect them in the classroom, and also how it affects them overall. Also, deaf and hard of hearing students will continue to go unnoticed and their mental health struggles unaddressed. So again, like with my own personal experience, I didn't know anything about mental health as a sophomore. And so I'm having my first panic attack and I have no idea how to handle it. Well, I have communication, I don't have a communication barrier, right? I went to a hearing school, my teacher spoke English, I speak English. But imagine that same situation with a student who doesn't have the same language as the adults around them who are supposed to support them. The issue will never be addressed. They'll never get the help that they need. And then finally, the deaf community overall will continue to be underserved and uninformed about mental health and mental health resources. So the same thing, but on a larger scale. And then these are my references, not my resources. We'll be developing resources. Okay, so does anybody have